This is Jose Merino, Editor-in-Chief of the Neurology family of journals. The Neurology podcast provides practical information to neurologists and other clinicians to help them provide better care for their patients. Thanks for listening and have a great week.
Hello, I'm Jessica Ailani. Welcome to the Neurology podcast. Have you ever flown by air before and gotten a headache? While not an uncommon occurrence, airplane headache can be disabling, sometimes causing people to avoid air travel altogether. Imagine getting a headache while flying in space. I'm joined today by author of the paper, Frequency and Clinical Features of Space Headache Experienced by Astronauts During Long-Haul Space Flights, by W.P.J. van Oosterhout. Ron, welcome.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you for having me.
Well, many of our listeners will never have heard about space headache. It's considered an uncommon headache disorder, though it has been included in the International Classification of Headache Disorders, version 3. Since most of us don't have the opportunity to meet an astronaut, much less take care of one, it may not be something a neurologist will ever come across. Ron, what made you decide to study space headache?
Well, there was a bit of a part of a decision and part a bit of serendipity. When I was still doing my PhD in the Ailani University, a PhD in headache, in migraine, one of my colleagues, Ailani, was interested in space headache and had already done a small study retrospectively into the prevalence of space headaches among astronauts and wanted actually to extend that study and make a bigger study so we could understand the incidence and characteristics of space headache better. And I got to speak to her and I got very enthusiastic, and then I was able to join the space headache team and actually perform those studies and looking further into space headache.
And it's so cool. If I were you, I think I would probably be the first to raise my hand and volunteer and be like, yeah, I think I'll be a part of that team. So when you joined the team, what did you find? How common was it for astronauts when you had been studying at that point to have headaches during space travel?
Well, at that point, it was before we started our study, the new study. It was only known from anecdotal evidence by astronauts who had come back to Earth saying that they had suffered some headaches when in space. And a small questionnaire study studying a group of 17 astronauts who actually, 70% of them had also reported headaches when in space. So we knew something was going on, but we hadn't any clue about the extent of the headaches that they were suffering from or reporting. As again, my colleague had started this nice project already and I was able to join in, which has been an amazing experience for me as a PhD student and as a neurologist afterwards, because indeed it is a field, the field of space medicine, a field in which you don't easily get access to. So there was a really nice opportunity to meet people from medicine, but also from other niches from the space technology and space medicine world.
When the studies had been done, before we get to your study, there were some interesting things in the background and introduction of the paper about what the features were in the prior smaller studies of space headache. Can you tell us a little bit more before this study was started, what the idea was about the type of headache, the phenotype of headache that astronauts might have had when they went to space? Was it more tension type? Was it more migraine? What were they experiencing?
The headaches that were reported in the previous study was in 17 astronauts. Overall, 70% of them got a headache. And of those headache episodes, 12% was migraine-like in phenotype, while 28% was reported as being tension type-like. And the majority back in those days was defined as non-specific headache. Maybe, when looking back in detail, they could have been classified as a tension type headache as well. But 12% migraine and the rest was non-specific or tension type.
Okay, so I want our audience to try to remember this. In the prior studies, 17, very few number of astronauts, when they got headache in space, it looked more migraine, but there was this larger portion of undefined headache. When your group started this study, what were they hoping to find? What were the objectives?
The primary objective was to actually study the incidence of space headaches and the characteristics. And when it comes to the incidence, also looking to differences between short-term and longer-term stay in space. Because we had the feeling, based on stories from astronauts and the literature that was present, that there might be a difference in incidence and prevalence of headaches during the course of a space travel. We expected in a way that astronauts would mainly in the first week suffer from headaches, and that after the first week all those headaches would go away, people would be headache free and be able to perform all their difficult tasks tasks that they have on board of the space station. So that was what we had in mind when setting off this study.
I find that fascinating because as a headache specialist, we often think when you have a headache, when you have this initial headache, you change features in the brain. And, I'm trying to make this very simple, but you turn on something. And once you start getting headaches, you continue to get headaches. So I think that your objective and your team's hypothesis were brave and very intriguing. So you were suspecting they would kind of settle into their environment and be okay. As someone living on Earth, I would have thought the complete opposite, especially someone who sees tons of headaches. So I just want to say this is one reason I thought this study was very interesting, very well designed to really think through what you wanted to find out. And as we're going to get to the methods, there were really two parts of the study. There was the prospective part of what happens during their time in space, but also what happened to them once they came back to Earth. What happens to not this particular crew, but astronauts? Because again, my idea as a headache specialist, something once it's turned on, perhaps they'll have more frequent headaches when they're on Earth long term. You really were able to answer this question. And I think this is why this study to me is particularly very exciting. So let's talk a little bit about the methods here. This study has two parts, a prospective part and a retrospective part.
As a headache specialist, I would expect a patient who is vulnerable to headaches to not only develop headaches, but also to keep getting headaches. But in this case, we had super healthy astronauts who, in general, did not suffer from regular headaches or recurrent headaches or had a diagnosis of migraine or any other headache disorder on Earth. So they were completely healthy people. And that's why our hypothesis was that mainly in the first week, within the framework of a space adaptation syndrome, the astronauts would have headaches in space, but that they actually would settle a bit after 1 or 2 weeks. So that was the background of the hypothesis we had for this study. Yeah, and then to come to your question, we indeed designed the study with two different parts. We were not only able to perform a retrospective questionnaire study in 42 astronauts who had flown between 2006 and 2016, but also, and that's the most interesting part of the study, I think, we're able to work together with ESA and NASA to do a prospective study in which a total of 24 astronauts could be included. Astronauts who stayed in space in the International Space Station for up to 24 weeks, so that's almost half a year. And we were able to record their headaches on a prospective way in the first week with daily measurements, and in the period of time after the first week with weekly measurements. And altogether, this is something we as a team are very proud of, that in space medicine, a group of 66 astronauts really is a big group of patients. So really happy to be able to include 66 astronauts as a total. And then for the retrospective study, what we did is we designed a space headache questionnaire, actually based on the criteria of the International Classification of Headache Disorders. Very detailed questions on headache characteristics, on accompanying symptoms, but also on treatment options that the astronauts choose to treat their headaches. So that was a very nice cohort already. And then for the prospective study, we chose to do a similar way. We were able to perform a questionnaire study on a daily basis in the first week. Those were most often recorded in the digital system on board the ISS. Every day a questionnaire, and then after the first week a weekly questionnaire. And then we asked astronauts not only how many headache episodes they had, but also the details of symptoms and characteristics. And in case some astronauts reported that they had more than 2 headache episodes a day, or after the first week more than 1 headache episode in the week, we asked them to choose the strongest or the severest one to describe for us.
So I do agree with you. I think these are extremely robust findings, quite a large number of astronauts that were queried. I'm not sure people are going to be able to reproduce a higher number of astronauts to answer this many questions. So Ron, if you could briefly summarize for our listeners, in the prospective part, what did you learn about headaches in space flight? How many astronauts had headache? What happened during the time period? What were the headaches like?
Yeah, in the prospective cohort, we had 24 participating astronauts, of which 22, that's almost 92%, reported headache episodes. And the number of headache episodes that ranged from, the average was 9, but the range was between 1 up until 128 different headache episodes. 9% of those, they only reported the headaches in the first week, and 40% only in the first half of the mission. So that's where we clearly see that there is some kind of adaptation going on into space. And some of the astronauts indeed only have the headaches in the first week or the first half mission, and then they settle a bit. And then if you look at the phenotyping of the headache episodes, what kind of headaches were they? Well, we were able to pinpoint that. And on average, 90% were tension type headaches, and 10% they fulfilled the criteria for migraine according to the ICHD in phenotype. And interestingly, we did see a difference between first week headache episodes and the headache episodes after the first week. The first week episodes, they were more often of a migraine phenotype. They also had more accompanying symptoms, nausea, facial edema, and they tended to be of short duration than the later headaches.
Very interesting. So most astronauts did get headaches. Most were tension type. Most got better after the first week. But if they lingered, they tended to be more migraine type and shorter. So it kind of really gives us a lot of information in this very elaborate study. Did you think there were any environmental changes that could explain having a headache and then the change of headache over time? You mentioned this, and I'm going to misquote this, as space syndrome, like something happens to them in that first few weeks of space travel. This must be something you've learned by working with this great team of yours.
What happens in the first week is what is called the space adaptation syndrome or the space maladaptation syndrome, which is actually a kind of motion sickness. Your body as a whole has to adapt to microgravity or the lack of normal gravity. Normal gravity on Earth is a way for the body that pulls everything down. It creates spaces for blood pressure. The blood has to go up, has to be pumped up by the heart for the cardiovascular system. But it also, within the inner ear, helps the proprioception and where you are in space. So your body knows where it is in space when you are on Earth. But when you are in space, there is no gravity and your body gets all mixed up and is suffering from a severe form of motion sickness. That was known already from the 70s and 60s and 80s by astronauts being in space. They were really sick, nauseous, really sick as well, as to vomit. They also noticed that they got puffy faces, they had facial edema, congested noses, and they were dizzy. So all these symptoms together are part of the space adaptation syndrome. And as the word was chosen, it is an adaptation syndrome. So within a week time, the body gets adjusted to this lack of gravity, luckily.
So moving on to the main learnings from your retrospective part of the study, what were the takeaways from that part of the study?
The retrospective study results actually confirmed our prospective findings, or were totally in line with that. Almost a similar prevalence of space headache was reported by astronauts, and also when it comes to the types of headache and the accompanying symptoms, it was similar. That's interesting because in the retrospective part, some astronauts filled in or reported headaches during, for example, extravehicular activity when being outside the space station or during the launch. And then, of course, as you can imagine, it's a completely different environment with different gravitational forces and ambient parameters. But in general, the findings of the retrospective study actually confirmed the prospective findings, and we were really happy to see that. And also, what is interesting, other ambient parameters we checked at, because we knew from astronauts, they were telling us, they were actually telling us stories saying, it seems that the level of CO2, of carbon dioxide levels on board the space station, they have something to do with my headaches. I have the feeling that whenever the CO2 level is high, I get a headache. But this was pure anecdotal evidence. And together with this study with ESA and NASA, we were able to actually combine data on ambient parameters, so on CO2 levels, on O2 levels, on temperature and pressure, and actually be able to have a look in a regression analysis to see if there's any correlation between the occurrence of headaches and a variation in ambient parameters. And actually, we couldn't confirm what the astronauts told us. We didn't see anything in the data showing that a high level of CO2 or a low O2 level was linked to headache occurrence in our data set. So that's something that's also positive for the astronauts, that in a way we saw that all the ambient parameters were kept in a narrow range, so it's well controlled. So there is not that much variability in those levels, and that could be an explanation why there is no association found with headache occurrence in our data.
Yeah, I also think it's extremely normal human nature to try to explain not feeling well with environmental changes. So another reason why I think it's an excellent study is the ability to have measured that and correspond that to how they were feeling, and to really provide some level of evidence back to the astronauts to say, no, it's not environmental changes, but it has a lot to do with space travel itself. And this is a natural part of travel. I think this study really adds a lot, not only to headache medicine, but to the field of space medicine itself. And to be able to tell astronauts this should be an expected part of travel, potentially, and how to manage it, and not to be worried that your head is going to blow up, or the CO2 levels aren't appropriate, or, this might get better within a week, and this is what to expect. And these types of medicines help. I think there's a lot to be said for these kinds of findings and what it can do for the person who's in space and really doesn't have access to talk to someone about this. So, Ron, any final words, anything else you want to say to our listeners today before we sign off?
Well, maybe it's good to also have a look at the clinical context of our findings, because, as a headache neurologist myself, I don't also see that many astronauts as headache patients in my outpatient clinic. But I do think we can learn as the headache field from our findings in this study. This study firstly shows that you can trigger headaches in super healthy people. The underlying pathological mechanisms, we think, are twofold. In the first week is the space adaptation syndrome, so the motion sickness story. But the second, after the first week, we believe that an increase in intracranial pressure is the cause of the headaches that some of the astronauts suffer from. And in a way, this space model actually is quite an interesting model to study intracranial hypertension headaches, for example. It still is an hypothesis, but at the same time, from colleague researchers who also performed studies in astronauts, for example, from the ophthalmology research groups, we know that there is evidence from increase in intracranial pressure visible within the papilla, so papilledema, for example. So from the clinical point of view, I think it's really worth mentioning that this can be seen maybe as a model for studying a very logistically challenging model to study intracranial pressure. What does it do when it comes to headache? What are the other side effects of it? And also what happens when you go back to normal gravity, so when the pressure normalizes again and the headache resides. And maybe one other thing to add, luckily we are able to not only study space headache in space, but also on Earth. Together with, again, ESA and sometimes NASA, we can do on Earth simulation studies of microgravity. Healthy volunteers, they actually enter what we call a bed rest protocol, and they are laid down in a bed, supine, or even with the head tilted 6 degrees lower. In that way, we create a lack of gravitational force over the length of the body. And if people then lay down for a few days or a week or even longer, you can actually see the same changes occur in the human body as they occur in space because of the lack of normal gravity, including the occurrence of those space headaches. So altogether, it's a fantastic field. I'm really honored that I was able to participate in this specific study, and I really hope we're looking forward to continuing our collaboration with different research groups all over the world in trying to solve this puzzle of space headache.
Well, thank you, Ron, for taking the time to share your findings with us on this episode of the Neurology podcast. I'm Jessica Ailani, and we just discussed the article, Frequency and Clinical Features of Space Headache Experienced by Astronauts During Long-Haul Space Flights by Van Oosterhout and his team. Make sure to read the full article coming soon in the Neurology Journal and learn more about space headache.
This is Stacey Clardy, your podcast editor. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please take a few moments to subscribe, rate, and review the Neurology podcast through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And remember, you can always head to neurology.org/podcast for our full list of past episodes. Or you can also search by keyword in your podcast app for any neurology-specific topics you want to learn about.